Hello, I hope you're well, and welcome to this series of observations by Real World Ranching. This is observation number 6, and the name is What Does Nature Know That We Have Forgotten? One question has quietly followed me through much of my life. At first, I didn't even realize I was asking it. It wasn't a question I learned in college. No professor ever asked it. No textbook tried to answer it. But it slowly emerged after years of walking through ranches, forests, native grasslands, and places where nature had been left almost entirely alone. The question is surprisingly simple. What does nature do when we stop trying to manage her? Imagine standing in the middle of an old-growth forest. No one planted it, no one fertilizes it, no one sprays herbicides, no one decides which species should survive and which should disappear. No one manages it. Yet, year after year, life continues to increase. There are more plants, more insects, more birds, more fungi, more organisms, more relationships, and everything becomes richer, not only in the number of living things, but in its ability to support even more life. Why? That question stayed with me for years, because when I looked at many of the ranches around me, I often saw the opposite. Every year, they seemed to need a little more help, more fertilizer, more machinery, more supplemental feed, a little more intervention, many times just to maintain the same results. How could that be? How could nature, without a manager, continue increasing her ability to create life, while we, with all our technology, education, and effort, so often reduced that same ability? For years, I searched for the answer. At first, I thought it had to be better tools. Later, I believed it was better genetics. Then, I became convinced no, it's better management. And each explanation made sense. Each one explained part of the story. None explained all of it. Eventually, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The real difference wasn't in what nature possessed. It was hidden in how nature works. That realization completely changed the way I began looking at every ranch I visited. Because perhaps the most important question was how wasn't how does nature produce more? Perhaps the better question is what principles allow nature to create more life year after year, generation after generation? Because if we can understand those principles, perhaps we can stop trying to improve nature and finally begin learning from her. Because I have come to believe that nature is not waiting for us to teach her how to create abundance. She has been doing it successfully for millions of years. The real question is, what has she been trying to teach us that we have failed to notice? For a long time, I believed the extraordinary richness of a forest came from the sheer number of species living within it. It seemed obvious: towering trees, diverse shrubs, vines, birds, insects, fungi, mammals, millions of living organisms sharing the same piece of ground. Surely that had to be the answer. The more species, the more abundance. But the longer I walked through those places, the more I began to doubt my own explanation. Something didn't quite fit. Because a single seed cannot create a forest, neither can one magnificent tree, or one bird, or one fungus, no matter how remarkable an organism may be, none of them create abundance alone. So where does abundance actually come from? And that question stayed with me for years. Then one day, I noticed something I had been overlooking all along. Every living thing seemed to be changing the world for something else. A tree wasn't simply growing, it was creating shade. Its roots were holding soil in place. Its leaves were feeding organisms I couldn't even see. A bird wasn't simply looking for food, it was carrying seeds to places where new life could begin. Nothing seemed to exist only for itself. Every organism was leaving behind opportunities that other organisms could use. And that observation quietly changed the way I looked at nature. Perhaps abundance doesn't grow because there are more living things. Perhaps abundance grows because every form of life makes it easier for other forms of life to exist. I couldn't prove it yet. I only knew that everywhere I looked, I kept finding the same pattern. Life seemed to be building more life, one opportunity creating another, one generation preparing the way for the next. It reminded me of something I've seen many times outside the ranch. A family is more than the people who belong to it. An orchestra is more than its musicians. A great company is more than the talent of the individuals who work there. Something happens between the people, something invisible, something that cannot be measured by counting heads. And nature seemed to be working the same way. So the more I observed, the less interested I became in the individual organisms. Instead, I found myself asking a completely different question. What is happening between them? Because perhaps the greatest secret of nature has never been the living creatures themselves, but what becomes possible when they begin working together. And that led me to an even deeper question. If abundance is not created by the organisms alone, what is actually moving between them that allows life to keep expanding? It seems like there was an invisible word. And the more time I spent walking nature and healthy ecosystems, the more I realized that the most important part of nature is almost impossible to see. We see the trees, but not what is happening between them. We see the grass, but not what allows it to keep growing. We see the cattle, but not everything that makes that animal possible. And one day, without even planning it, I began asking a different question. Instead of asking, what am I looking at? I began asking, what is happening here that my eyes cannot see? And suddenly, the landscape changed. Nothing was standing still. Rain fell from the sky, but the story didn't end there. Some of it enters the soil, some nourished the root, some slowly returned to the atmosphere. The journey continued long after the storm was over, and sunlight was doing the same thing. Every morning it arrived without making a sound. Leaves captured it, plants transformed it, animals harvested it. Eventually, it reached forms of life hidden beneath the soil that most people never think about. Even a fallen leaf refused to stay still. To us, it looked like the end, but to nature, it was the beginning of another story. It became food, then energy, then soil, then life again. The longer I observed, the harder it became to think of nature as a collection of objects. Nothing existed in isolation. Nothing simply was. Everything was becoming something else. Everything was participating in a story much larger than itself. And then I noticed something else. When one of those invisible journeys was interrupted, the consequences often appeared somewhere completely different. A problem rarely showed up where it actually began, and it reminded me of a river. If someone builds a dam high in the mountains, the greatest changes may happen many miles downstream, because the place where we notice the problem isn't always where the problem began. And I had seen that pattern before on ranches. A pasture loses vigor, a creek begins to dry, cattle performance declines. Most of us immediately focus on what we can see. Nature quietly invites us to look somewhere else, somewhere upstream, somewhere earlier, somewhere invisible. That realization changed the way I walked every ranch from that day forward. I no longer looked only for what was present. I began looking for what had stopped moving, because perhaps the health of a living system is not determined only by what it contains, but by what continues to move through it. And if that is true, then perhaps abundance is created in a way very few of us have ever been taught to see. The next question became unavoidable. If nature becomes richer because something keeps moving, what allows that movement to continue year after year without anyone directing it? As I continued observing nature, another question slowly emerged. If all these invisible processes are constantly moving, why don't they eventually stop? After all, machines wear out. Every battery runs down. Every fuel tank is eventually empty. Yet, a mature forest seems to do exactly the opposite, because the older it becomes, the more life it supports. How is that possible? The answer didn't come at once. It revealed itself little by little. I began noticing that very few things in nature work alone. The shade of a tree protects the soil. The cooler soil holds more moisture. The moisture allows countless organisms to remain active. Those organisms improve the soil. The healthier soil helps the tree grow stronger. So nothing is working for itself alone. Everything seems to make something else possible. And the deeper I looked, the more I found the same pattern. A flowering plant feeds an insect. The insect pollinates another flower. That flower produces seeds. A bird carries those seeds somewhere else. The next generation begins, and no one is giving instructions, no one is directing the process. And yet, something extraordinary keeps happening. Life creates better conditions for more life. And then I remembered something I had seen many times on ranches. Occasionally, a small management change would produce results far greater than expected. Not because the practice itself was so powerful, but because it allowed many other processes to begin supporting one another again. And at first I thought I had improved the pasture. Later, I realized something much more profound. The pasture had begun improving itself. That may sound like a small difference, but it isn't. It changes the role of the manager completely. Perhaps our greatest responsibility is not to solve every problem ourselves. Perhaps it is to remove the obstacles that prevent life from solving more of them on its own. And that idea stayed with me for a long time. Because once a living system begins strengthening itself, its future no longer depends entirely on us. Its own capacity begins to grow. And that may be the greatest difference between a system that is only surviving and one that becomes increasingly abundant. The more I thought about it, the more another question refused to leave me. If nature has spent millions of years increasing her capacity to create life, what should be the true purpose of those of us who are entrusted with managing the land? That question stayed with me for a long time. What should be the true purpose for someone who manages the land? At first, the answer seemed obvious. More beef, more milk, grass, more profit. And those are important goals, but are they really the destination? Or are they simply consequences of something deeper? And the more I observed nature, the more another question began to replace the first one. When nature creates abundance, what is she actually increasing? Is she trying to grow bigger trees? Or is something else becoming greater every year? When I walk through an old forest, I never have the impression that nature is chasing production. She seemed to be building something far more valuable: capacity. Capacity to support more life. Capacity to recover after disturbance. Capacity to hold more water. Capacity to capture more sunlight. Capacity to feed more organisms. The capacity to prepare the next generations. And once I saw that, another question quietly appeared. If nature measures success by increasing capacity, why do we so often measure success only by this year's production? Could it be that we've been measuring the result instead of measuring what made the result possible? Perhaps that's why two ranches can produce the same number of pounds this year while moving in completely opposite directions. One may be building greater capacity, the other may be quietly consuming it. And from a distance, they can look identical. But are they? How would we know? Would we notice it by looking at the cattle, at the grass, the soil? Or would we have to learn to see something we've never been taught to observe? Then another question came to me, one that has never left. Every decision we make changes something. But what if the most important change isn't what happens today? What if every decision is either increasing or decreasing the future capacity of that land to create life? If that's true, then perhaps every grazing decision, every breeding decision, every financial decision, every management decision is really answering a much deeper question. Not what do I want from this ranch, but what kind of ranch am I creating? And perhaps that same question reaches much further than ranching. What kind of business am I creating? What kind of family? What kind of community? What kind of world? I don't know if nature asks those questions, but after many years of watching her, I have begun asking them myself. And maybe that is where the greatest transformation of an observer begins. Not when we discover better answers, but when we begin living with better questions. because perhaps the greatest lesson nature has been trying to teach us all along has never been about producing more. Perhaps it has always been about becoming worthy of creating more life. And that leaves us with one final question. If that is the journey, who must change first? The land or the observer? After many years of walking through ranches, forests, pastures, and places that had been quietly teaching her lessons for thousands of years, I've come to realize something I never expected. Nature has never tried to impress me. She has never tried to convince me that she is right. She has simply continued doing what she has always done, creating more life, season after season, generation after generation, patiently, quietly, faithfully. Perhaps that is why she has become such a remarkable teacher. Not because she gives us answers, but because she keeps inviting us to ask better questions. When I was younger, I wanted to know how to produce more. Later, I wanted to know how to regenerate a ranch. But today, I find myself asking a very different question. What kind of decisions increase life ability to create even more life? And that question has changed the way I look at everything. Ranches, family, communities, businesses, even ourselves. Because perhaps every living system is asking the same question. Will the choices made today leave greater possibilities for tomorrow? I don't know of a more meaningful way to measure success. Not by what we harvested, not even by what we earned, but by the opportunities we leave behind. Perhaps that is what nature has been doing all along. Every generation preparing the way for the next. Every organism contributing something it may never personally benefit from. Every season quietly increasing the possibilities for another season yet to come. And if that's true, then maybe stewardship has never been about controlling life. Maybe it has always been about participating in something much larger than ourselves. That realization changed me far more than it changed my ranch. Because the greatest transformation never happened in the soil, or in the grass, or in the cattle. It happened in the observer. I began this journey believing I was learning how to manage land. Instead, I discovered that nature was teaching me how to see. And perhaps that is the real journey we have been taking together through these observations. Not a journey toward better grazing alone, but toward becoming better our observers. Because better observers ask better questions. Better questions lead to better decisions, and better decisions create better conditions. And better conditions allow life to do what it has always done best: create more life. If these observations have awakened that same curiosity within you, I would be honored to continue walking this journey together. That is why we created the Total Grazing Academy. Not because anyone there has finished learning, certainly not me. We created it as a community of observers, people who have discovered that every ranch, every season, every success, every mistake contains another lesson waiting to be seen. If you would like to continue this journey with us, I invited you to join the Total Grazing Academy waitlist. Not because you've reached the end, but because I hope you've just discovered that this is only the beginning. And before we part, I'd like to leave you with one final question. Not only for your ranch, one for your life. When someone walks through the world after you've been here, will they find greater opportunities for life than existed before you arrived? Because perhaps that is the truest measure of real wealth. Thank you for being here. I am Jaime Elizondo from Real Wealth Ranching, and I will see you in the next observation.